Actually, you know what? I'll ask you the first question.
Okay, and I'll ask you a question back.
There we go. Incidentally, if you don't read Brett in the sort of the long form interviews that he does occasionally in the New York Times, they're well worth reading. There was a great one where he and Gail Collins sat down, and you had a line about the Republican Party is split between reptiles and invertebrates, which is a great line, even if we don't understand exactly what it means. But what does it mean?
Well, Marjorie Taylor Greene is a reptile, and Kevin McCarthy cozying up to Marjorie Taylor Greene is the definition of an invertebrate. The line, of course, is made in the form of a conversation, and so it's a little sharper than it ought to be, because there are, in fact, a lot of terrific Republicans who stand up for a set of principles which I broadly share. And those are the Republicans who actually won their elections in November or outperformed in their elections. But I worry about a Republican Party that has, I think, been taken over by some of its worst instincts and poor characters. I mean, I remember how good I felt about voting for George W. Bush in 2000, a man who said that family values don't end at the Rio Grande, and someone who understood that conservatism ought to stand for a set of American traditions which include respect for the immigrant, which include the value of aspiration, which seek bipartisan compromises where they are available, and even when they're not, refuses to treat Democrats as the enemy. And I think that was a form of conservatism that both President Bushes stood for, which I had a lot of time for. I thought it was not only an honorable tradition, in many ways the right tradition, but I'm saying this to all of you in the room who are not Republicans or conservatives. You want, in any healthy democratic society, the health of it really depends on the health of its conservative party. And we used to have, when the conservative party was led by people like both President Bushes, President Reagan, John McCain, Mitt Romney, a very healthy conservative movement. Right now, we don't have that, in my view. And I'd love to know, more interested to know yours. But that seems to me a real problem, not just for the Republican Party, but for the United States itself. So let me turn the question back on you. Do you think that line was unfair? How do you see the state of the Republican Party today?
Well, first of all, I thought it was a great line. I'm not certain it was fair, but it was a great line. And look, I don't understand your animosity towards Marjorie Taylor Greene. She's put her finger on a vital problem facing the country, which is the presence of Jewish space lasers starting fires in Northern California. I'm deeply concerned about this, and I think it's something we ought to take seriously.
I just should stop right there because there's some jerk right now who's going to pretend you're speaking seriously.
So I loved it when she and Matt Gaetz came out and said, well, our endorsement in a primary is more important than Karl Rove's. And I thought, who the hell's concerned about that? But no, look, our party has always had weird elements. We had the John Birchers in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And we've had David Duke. As we made the southern swing, we began to get some very ugly people. But this is different because it's animated, I think, in large measure, not by values or views. It's animated by persona and process. I want to get on cable TV, and the way to do that is to say really ugly things. I want to have good responses in my digital fundraising, so I've got to be really ugly. And I'm not interested in being a legislator, I'm interested in being a character. And so I don't pay attention to developing strong relationships with my fellow committee members and figuring out what it is I want to work on financial services and seeing if I can find common ground. I just want to say something extreme that gets me invited to Steve Bannon's war room. And I think that's not healthy. But I'd take your point and broaden it a little bit. I think the country is better off when we have two prosperous, sensible political parties that are strong. And right now, both parties are weak, in part because of what we've done with the financing and so forth, a lot of technical things. But they're also broken in part because of success. The Republican Party was animated for a long time, and I think you've written about this, by hostility to Soviet communism, to worldwide communism. And we won that battle, at least with regard to the Soviet Union. And as a result, we started to fray at the edges. And the Democratic Party had led a long and honorable crusade for human rights, for the right of all people, regardless of color, to participate in the American dream. And that has had a great deal of success. And so we're now off trying to figure out what the next thing is. And both parties are as a result, sort of confused about what the future holds, but they're also vulnerable to takeovers by strong personalities, and it just so happened, at least in our party, it was overtaken by a personality. I love when he calls me a rhino. Karl Rove, loser, total loser. He's a rhino. He's a rhino. Because I remember being for George W. Bush in 2004 when he was for John Kerry. In fact, we're off the record here, right? No press? So I ended up in a meeting in May of 2016 with Trump at the New York apartment of a mutual friend. And it was like the weirdest 3 hours of my life. And at one point in the conversation, he's talking to our mutual friend and says, the older Jeb needs to say something nice about me. You're a very bad loser. He's not saying nice things. And somebody needs to talk to him. And he was clearly saying to my friend, the guy sitting next to me needs to say something to Jeb. I said, well, if I were you, I'd just drop it. Jeb's sort of a guy who's got strong feelings, and it makes you look weak because, you're trying to tell him to say nice things about you. And remember, it just reminds people that you said about a dozen times that you wouldn't support the nominee of the party if you didn't think you were treated fair. Do you think Jeb thinks you treated him fairly? So if you, I'd drop that all. He said, well, the older Bush, the old man, he needs to say something nice about me. I said, no, he don't. He's 91 years old. You beat his boy. He's earned a right to sit on the sidelines. He says, well, the younger Bush, he needs to say something nice about me. I said, no, he doesn't. I said, you were for John Kerry in 2004. I don't think so. No, I don't know. I said, well, in October of 2004, you said you agreed with George Bush on tax cuts, but you agreed with John Kerry on the war, and tax cuts were yesterday and the war was now. That sounds to me like a guy who's getting ready to vote for John Kerry. Well, I don't remember. I said, well, you are the guy that gave a lot of money to elect Nancy Pelosi Speaker in 2006, and in March of 2007, you were asked how good she was doing, and you said, you're doing a wonderful job, except she hasn't done enough to impeach George W. Bush. And I said, he said, well, yeah. And I said, and you're also the guy who said that you knew about 9/11 in advance and let 3,000 people die in order to plunge the country into war. And you're also the guy who said that he deliberately lied about the intel in Iraq. He said, well, I guess I said those things. And I said, so I wouldn't be counting on him saying anything nice about you.
Let me ask you, Karl, do you think, I wrote a column right after the midterms in which was titled something like, Donald Trump is finally finished. It's going to look really bad for me in the annals of punditry if that turns out to be wrong, but I don't think I'm wrong. Where do you think Trump stands now in the Republican Party?
Yeah, well, you may be right, and you could be wrong. Both of us have counted that guy out. Let me just find one thing here to answer your question. I think that a couple of things about him and about him declining. This is from a piece that's in the Wall Street Journal tomorrow. really well written, I'm impressed with the work that's gone into this. I think I've done a hell of a job with it myself. But these were interesting numbers. In December, in the USA Today Suffolk poll, people were asked two questions. Would you vote for Republicans? Will you vote for him if he runs? In other words, will you vote for him for the nomination? And do you want him to run? The percentage that want him to run in December was 31%. Now, 60-something percent in July, 50-some odd percent in November, and 47% in December said that they would vote for him. But think about that gap. You got 16% of the people who say, I'm willing to vote for him, but God, I really wish he wouldn't run. And you only have 31% that say, given my druthers, that's the guy. So something's going on there. And whether that's going to turn out to be the case, I think all depends on who the other candidates are and how well they run, and particularly the question of how big is the field. Here's some other great numbers. And I literally had to do a spreadsheet. There's this thing called Excel. It's amazing. I recommend it to you. Think about this. In February of 2016, he won 34% of the vote in the two primaries that month and got 84% of the delegates. In the early March primaries, he won 33, there were 15 of them. He won 33% of the vote and got 45% of the delegates. In the latter part of the month, he had 46% of the vote, but took 67% of the delegates. And the reason was we had too many people left in the race at that point, so they were splitting up the vote, not getting the threshold to get a delegate, but thereby giving him an inordinate grasp over the delegate hall. So the question is going to be, one of the key questions is going to be a tactical one. How quickly do people say, well, I had a run, but I don't really have a chance and I'm out of here? And that's awfully hard to do. I think it's going to happen, but it's awfully hard. Once you have the ambition to run for president, it's hard to say, well, if I stay in a couple more primaries, maybe it'll be like South Carolina for Biden, that somebody will save me. But both of those, I think, are going to be critical.
Is the governor of Florida going to run for president?
Yeah, he is. Yeah.
For sure.
It's I think being announced today, or maybe it was announced last night. He's coming to Dallas, Texas, and Houston, Texas, on the 3rd and 4th of March to speak at the Lincoln Day dinners of those two major county Republican parties. You don't do that unless you got a hankering to do something more than entertain people at the governor's mansion in Tallahassee. But there are going to be a lot. We've got a conference coming up on February 24th. We have a big voter registration project in Texas, and we have coming Chris Christie, Nikki Haley, Brian Kemp, interesting, Mike Pence, Tim Scott, Chris Sununu, Chris Christie, and Kevin McCarthy. And some of those people are coming, because they're thinking about it. Pardon me? Governor Larry Hogan.
Larry Hogan, former governor of Maryland.
Former governor of Maryland.
Yeah.
No, not coming. Nobody knows him in Texas. Yeah.
Yeah. So the Republican Party today, did it just have kind of a long, strange trip, or is it permanently altered?
Yes, to both. It's had a weird trip, and it will be altered in some ways. I'm not certain how big the ways will be, and I'd be interested in your reaction. I think this whole populist, national populism of, we are going to be America firsters, meaning we're neo-isolationists. We want to withdraw from the world. That ain't going to work. I don't think it's there. I mean, it's like people's opposition to Biden's retreat from Afghanistan was not, hey, you boggled it and 13 Americans died in Kabul. It was, why the hell are you giving up the advantage and letting the bad guys win? And so there is an element in our party that are neo-isolationists, but the vast majority of them retain an instinct that is, America has a role to play in the world, and Ronald Reagan was right, peace through strength. But there are some things, there is a healthy concern, I think, among a lot of people for what do we need to do for people who are not staying up, for the working middle class that has fallen behind. Now, a lot of that, my economist friends say a lot of that is exaggerated. But there are a lot of people who think, I got a lawn service in Dayton, Ohio, and it's hard to make ends meet, and it's because, the government helps those who got a lawyer in Washington, a lobbyist in the law, and a loophole in the law, and the system ain't fair. And there are some real needs, it strikes me, to reinvigorate training programs, alternatives to college. I mean, the whole idea that everybody has to go to a four-year university in order to have a good career, we need to get rid of that. We've got a little ranch in Blanco, Texas, and our ranch foreman's grandson wants to become a welder. Doesn't need to go to college for that. And we told him, we'll send you to Texas State Teachers Institute, Texas State Technical College, where in 18 months you can become a welder. And he'll start out making $105,000 a year at the age of 19. And so there are some healthy things there. And we've all got to deal with the issue of big tech. I have no idea. I mean, it strikes me that social media is so corrosive and so powerful, and these algorithms are so addictive and have such a corrosive impact on our social dialogue that we got to look into it. But I have no idea what the answer is.
So my fear, conservatism has always had a kind of two faces. There's a conservatism which emphasizes, first of all, nationality, borders, sovereignty, tradition. That's a European-style conservatism. There's an American tradition of conservatism which is very different, which is the idea that what should be conserved is itself a liberal order. The Constitution is a liberal document. The Declaration is a liberal document. So American conservatism, as I have always treasured it, hinges on the idea that we're trying to preserve or conserve is that old-fashioned liberal ideal that politics exists to maximize the liberty, the responsible exercise of liberty by the individual, so long as it doesn't impinge on the liberty of his fellow man or woman. And in addition to that, you might say that that vision is enhanced when institutions support habits of mind that create more responsible citizens. So conservatives believe in the family because we think, and there's a lot of empirical evidence to show this, that products of stable two-parent households tend to have better outcomes in life than those who aren't. Not to say that people who aren't children of single parents can't succeed, but their chances are diminished. We believe in institutions like the military because we think they're character forming. We believe in the value of business because it has qualities that are both institutional but also risk-taking. And so there's a whole architecture of values and virtues that go into maximizing the liberty of the individual. But at the end of the day, that vision of American conservatism doesn't forget that this republic was uniquely conceived to defend certain unalienable rights, not the least of which is the pursuit of happiness, a profoundly subjective and individualistic belief. And I think the Republican Party fundamentally changed between 2016 or 2015 and the present, in that it abandoned that vision of conservatism, which I think Reagan championed, the Bushes championed, McCain championed, and so on, to something closer to an old-fashioned blood and soil conservatism that has more in common with characters like Viktor Orban in Hungary, or some of the more, or Mrs. Le Pen, Marine Le Pen in France, than it has to do with the American version. In fact, the American version of conservatism that I admire is what in Europe is called liberalism, right? If you go to Holland, it's the Liberal Party that more or less champions my view. I think the challenge for the Republican Party today, the question mark for the Republican Party today, is can it find its way back from that kind of Trumpian, borders, nationality, trying to reverse the 14th Amendment to get rid of birthright citizenship, to go back to a different version, to that earlier version. And I think it could actually profit as a result for some of the reasons that you mentioned, which is that the Republican Party at its best is a party that stands for aspiration. It's not about winners in society. It's not about people who are rich, but it's about people who are aspiring to be rich, or at least aspiring to be a little richer than they are, a little better off, a little better educated. That's the sweet spot for the Republican Party. It's got to figure out how to get back there, and it's going to take a while.
Yeah, well, I couldn't agree more with what you said. I have a slightly different view on the nature of where we are. I don't think we're in as bad a shape when it comes to the rank and file of the Republican Party as it might be thought after the last couple of years. You mentioned strivers. Why is it that we're doing better among non-college educated whites and non-college educated blacks, particularly younger black men? And why are we doing better among Hispanics, certain kinds of Hispanics? Latinos and Tejanos in Texas, they're being affected by the border in part, but they're also being affected by the fact of the energy. You go down to, there's a high school in Far, Texas. They will graduate you from high school in a special program if you can apply and get in, which will give you a CDL license. Anybody know what a CDL license is? It means you can drive a truck. And these kids are getting out of high school in Far, Texas and going to work in the oil patch, making six figures to start. And what's happening in South Texas is the further west you get, the more you get into oil country along the Rio Grande River, and the bigger the shift between 2016 and 2020, because they said, wait a minute, I got a job in the oil patch and they want to kill hydrocarbons. They want to take my job away, and my wife's working at the cafe and getting good tips from the oil field crowd that comes in for lunch, and they want to ruin that. Then you go to South Florida where you got not just the Cubanos, but the Venezuelans and the Colombians, and they're sitting there saying, those Democrats are starting to sound more like socialists. We want the freedom and aspiration and an opportunity to strive that the Republicans seem to be for. So I think, you know, Brett and I share an affection for immigration. And so as I go around the country, I sort of fly into it. And, you know, yeah, we got to control the border. I mean, I spent a lot of time in the White House over 7 years doing crazy stuff to try and end catch and release, because Bush felt a precondition to getting comprehensive immigration reform was stopping the border crossings as much as humanly possible, and particularly ending catch and release. Get the people, release them, they don't show up for a date, their court date. So, but when I get this issue and people say, no amnesty. I say, well, okay, fine, no amnesty. But let me ask you something. Somebody comes here, they've been here for years. What if we say you got to surface within a certain period of time, like 6 months? You got to give us your fingerprints so we can check and see if you committed a crime. But if you haven't, you can stay here if you want to work. But your employer or you has got to pay a fee to check and make certain you're paying your taxes and keeping your nose clean. And if you want to become a citizen, fine. But you have to go to the very back of the line. Nobody gets in front of you. I mean, everybody gets in front of you. You don't get in front of anybody. So it means it'll take you 13, 15, or 18 years before you can become a citizen. And when you do, you're going to have to know how to read, speak, and write English. And you're going to have to pass a test, a citizenship test, that's more than the one that we've got today, which is, what's the capital of America? Buffalo, St. Louis, Washington, D.C., or Palm Springs. I mean, and inevitably, even the hard asses on immigration will say, well, that makes sense. Many of them, at least the ones who can be won. I think the conservative movement is desperate for leaders who will stand up and say, here's our vision, and it's positive and optimistic, and it is based on exactly the principles. Small L liberalism. Our goal is that all people are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that's what that's why we favor limited government and the greatest realm of personal responsibility and personal freedom. And we're not blood and soil. You know, we're not. America is an idea, and it is the fact that we have strived for that ideal since the founding of the country. Then that July 4th, the creation of the Declaration of Independence, that's what America is about. And that's when people, that's what gives people, it's not that, geez, my forebears came here and bled on the soil of, Plymouth Rock in, 1620. I mean, it's that we came to America with nothing and ended up being given the opportunity to become something.
You reminded me of a great story. George Balanchine, the choreographer, had a succession of ballerina wives. Not all of whom were the cleverest, At one point, one of them was trying to get her immigration, get citizenship, and kept failing the quiz, the test. And so finally, a very well-intended immigration officer came to Balanchine's home and was giving her the test. She was getting one question after another wrong. Finally, he said, "Okay, lady, just one more thing. Who was, just get this question right. Who was the first president of the United States?" And she goes, this I know. George Washington Bridge.
Yeah. You know, not to get too personal about this, but this really is, I mean, immigration is both a great challenge for the Republicans and a great opportunity. The challenge is if we stop at saying secure the border. And look, I feel, and I'm seeing what it's doing to my state. I'm seeing what it's doing to border communities. And it's terrible, and the federal government is failing its responsibility. But we also need to look at the other side of the equation, which is look in your own history. Look in your own history. I went to the White House, and I hung up on my office wall at the White House the passports of the first American Rove, Olaf Julius Rove. My father, who lived here in this town, sent them to me in 2001, and I had them framed and hung in my office in the White House, Olaf Julius Rove, about whom I knew little, except this. He was 16 years old and the second son of a poor peasant family, and he had no prospects. I have visited the Rove family farm in Halden, Norway. It is the size of a soccer field. It is barely larger than this room. And he had no prospects, and somehow they cobbled together enough money to send him at the age of 16, speaking not a word of English, first to Brooklyn and then on a train to Milwaukee. And there he was met by his cousin in the middle of the winter and lived the first winter in the barn of his distant cousin in Devils Lake, Wisconsin. And to keep body and soul together, he made a lift-top desk. And by the spring, he'd learned enough English to talk his way into getting hired. By the fall, he talked his way into the University of Wisconsin. He worked his way through school, literally flinging cow dung and doing anything he possibly could to make his way through school. He graduates. He ends up marrying his best friend's sister, moves to Milwaukee, begins to sell insurance to fellow Norwegians, and becomes a prosperous insurance man and the honorary vice consul of Norway in Milwaukee. What I did not know is I hung up his picture. I did not know the next part of the story. The Norwegian ambassador was thrilled. There were two Norwegian Americans in the White House, me and now Admiral Mike Miller, former commander of the U.S. Reagan Battle Group and superintendent of the Naval Academy. But back then he was head of the White House military office. And we were both Norwegian, so the Norwegian ambassador brought us each a box of King Håkon chocolates about this big and gave us it for Christmas. And I was very popular for a couple of days as everybody came by and got their chocolate. But he saw these passports, and he saw the picture that I had hanging of Olaf Julius Rove, very imperial-looking guy, and he was in, black, dinner dress. He had a funny little emblem hanging underneath his tie. He said, "Who's that?" I explained to him who he was. He said, "Interesting. Do you know what that is?" I said, "I have no idea." So a couple weeks later, I got invited to dinner at the Norwegian embassy. And as Rock Schnabel can tell you, you don't want to go to embassy dinners if you're at the White House because everybody just gloms onto you. "I need to see the president. Take this to the president." So anyway, but I said, "What the hell? It's the Norwegians." So we went, and it turned out it was 4 people. My wife and me and the ambassador, and we had a lovely reindeer with lingonberry sauce. And at the end of the meal, the ambassador says, "You don't seem to know much about your forebear, so I thought you might enjoy this," and gave me 2 file folders. One, copies of documents and the original documents, all in Norwegian, and the other is translation. Norway becomes an independent country in 1905, and shortly after that, Olaf Julius Rove is invited to become the first ambassador of an independent Norway to the United States. Exchange of letters, His Majesty has authorized me to offer you this position. Would you do this? Here to require, back and forth, back and forth. Finally, he sends a letter and says, "It is with great regret that I must decline His Majesty's kind invitation. It would require me to give up my U.S. citizenship, a prize too dear." The little emblem is the Order of St. Olaf, the Presidential Medal of Freedom for Norway, for all the work that he did. He never forgot he was an immigrant. So some poor kid gets off of the train in Milwaukee and needs a warm place to stay and a hot meal and a train ticket to the farm country further west. That was his job. He started out as nothing. Nothing. He came here with nothing. And his great-grandson got to work in the White House. And I have the desk. I keep that desk in my front foyer so that when I walk out every day, I remember I am 3 generations away from a discard. I'm 3 generations away from the kind of person that the rest of the world throws away and the United States adopts, holds to its heart, and has turned this country into the greatest country on the face of the earth.
Can I make a suggestion, Karl? That was a beautiful story. We got 13 minutes left. We're supposed to talk about what conservatism is today. Why don't we open it up for some audience questions, and we'll take as many as we can field. So,
Shout it out. Question, not a speech.
What do each of you think is the most important issue
For
for 2023?
2023, in terms of policy or politics? Yeah. First, we've got to keep America strong. I'm worried about the dangerous world in which we live. And right behind that is we need to begin to take incremental steps to put our fiscal house in order. Medicare Hospital Trust Fund goes belly up in a couple of years. 2035, Social Security Trust Fund runs out of money. We need to take the spending programs in the government. We don't need to cut. We need to restrain. If we restrain the future growth of government spending to less than the increase in the size of our economy, then we buy ourselves some time. But we got to put our fiscal house in order.
I would say 2 things. Economic growth, which can only be, look, I have very little faith in seeing any Congress get control of any kind of spending. The only way that problem is going to be solved is if you grow the denominator and you grow it through unleashing the potential of the American people to innovate, create value. And so a dynamic economy that recognizes that we have to press every advantage we have, including the advantages we have in our North American energy market, is going to be vitally important. But to me, we are living through 1940 all over again. And what is happening in Ukraine, what is happening across the straits between Taiwan and China, and the potentially impending nuclearization of Iran are threats that are as serious as America has seen in generations. And if we don't address those forcefully, quickly, and create a pedagogy in which Americans understand that our interests at home depend on what happens in Donbass or Taiwan or Iran, we're going to be in a world of trouble. So that question of national strength, particularly at a moment like this, is what really animates me.
Yeah. Apropos of his comment about growth, I recommend a thin, brilliant volume called The Growth Deficit by James Pearson. Have you read this?
I have not, but I
It's
like James.
fabulous because he makes exactly that point. There's only so much we can do in a modern economy to restrain spending, particularly when so much of it is mandatory. But he makes the point that if we do not pay attention to the growth side of it, we have a growth deficit in the country. We grow the economy stronger. A lot of our problems begin to get less demanding and less harmful in the short run, and we have time to make reforms that will.
Right, and just very briefly, immigration reform is crucial to that because we have a shrinking labor force or a static labor force. You can't grow an economy if you aren't growing a population. And don't forget, most of our Fortune 500 companies are run by either immigrants or the children of immigrants. They are the dynamic side of America because they're the ones who are striving for something the most.
What about, how does the Republican Party feel about early childhood care, particularly for the underserved?
Early childhood care, Paul?
I got a grandchild. Yeah, how do Republicans feel about early childhood care? And it ain't at the top of the list. For the underserved. Well, we have a lot of programs for the underserved, but the biggest program we can have for them is to get quality education. We are failing our children.
Yes, that's what I'm talking
Yeah, no, we're absolutely failing our children. Well, and it does, but for example, Head Start, which we spend a lot of money on, has absolutely no impact on improving the learning experience and the learning curve of children. We're spending money on programs that don't work because we've been spending money on programs that don't work. And we're just sort of stuck there. We've got to, Lincoln was a conservative, but he also said, as our case is new, so must we think and act anew. And, and we ought to be looking at these things that we're doing in government and figuring out, are these things working? And if not, what can we do to do better? For example, programs that are focused, you remember phonics? We now know that phonics in kindergarten, first, second, and third grade delivers an incredible improvement in the reading scores of our children, and yet because it was old-fashioned, we've dropped it, when we ought to be focused on, because it's the thing that will allow children to escape failed schools. I mean, think about it. I was in Washington, D.C. last weekend, and the question came up on Fox News Sunday of Education, and I said, we're in the District of Columbia. 50% of the students who enter schools in the nation's capital never graduate from high school. That is a stain on our country. And we ought to focus on things, but it's not, a lot of this is sort of like woo-woo, and a lot of it is things that actually have been proven to work, and we ought to be focused on those.
Sir.
You got commented on the Supreme Court in the conservative bent that we have. The interpretation of our Constitution seems to be from one party different from the other party. I think that we need to take a look at that in some way. I'd like to hear your comments.
Well, I'm probably more of a Justice Roberts conservative than I am a Justice Alito conservative, in that I think that the court also ought to respect legislatures, and it ought to respect the fact that abrupt social changes foisted on the country from 6 unelected people are often a very bad idea. When I grew up, I used to read people like Bob Bork, who said, we don't elect, the Supreme Court is not a body of philosopher kings. And so I had I don't know where Karl stands on this. I had real problems with the Dobbs decision, because for 49 years, American women in particular, but Americans had taken it as a right to have access to abortion services. And that was abruptly withdrawn. Now, some of my conservative friends say, well, for more than 50 years, the terrible Plessy decision stood, and just because it had long been precedent didn't mean that the Warren Court was wrong to overturn it in Brown versus Board. To me, to my mind, that's fundamentally different. Plessy withdrew a right, which then Brown helped restore. Roe extended a right, which Dobbs now withdraws. And I think that was a problematic approach for the court. It could have taken, even being mindful of the states' rights argument, it could have taken a much more deliberate approach. I think that was a badly decided case. Now, don't come back to me in 4 months when I am cheering the end of affirmative action in the Harvard and North Carolina cases. Who was it who said a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds? It was Emerson. So I'm going by his standard, but I expect the court will reverse Bakke and those decisions, and I think it'll actually be good for the country. And I acknowledge the inconsistency.
I'm not certain it is inconsistent, because Bakke took away a right, the right to be treated fairly.
Yeah, that's true.
I've never understood how saying to somebody, we're going to end discrimination by discriminating against people. And Bakke essentially, created a right to discriminate, particularly if you just happen to be bright and Asian American, for example. I'm with you. The court has a tension, and conservatives, I think, have to straddle that tension. The tension is, on the one hand, they are the defender of the Constitution as written. And on the other hand, they have to live in a society that is 200 and some odd years changed and deal exactly what Bret was talking about. For 50 years, we had a right, and they could have modified that right instead of abandoning that right. And that's the tension conservatives face. But in the case of Bakke, you know, it was creating a right for some who felt discriminated against. You're going to be aided affirmatively, but it was at the expense of treating somebody else unfairly. And we got just a couple of minutes, but this also brings up the issue of education and the issue of wokeness in education. I was appalled that one of the great public schools in America, Thomas Jefferson High School in Fairfax County, Virginia, basically discriminated against bright young people who were overwhelmingly Asian American by saying, we're not going to let them know that they're National Merit Scholars, which would allow them to get into universities they might not otherwise get into, get scholarships that they're not otherwise going to be accessible, get access to, because we've decided that this is, you know, this is inappropriate behavior because they have privilege. Well, they got privilege because they got a brain and applied it. And it's interesting. I think this is one of the rare moments where something that emerged on its own during the years of that Trump was in power, whether it was defund the police or this kind of weirdness. And you know, we're gonna change the name of Abraham Lincoln High School in San Francisco because everybody knows he was a bigot. And this kind of stuff has sort of united the Republican Party during this time of Trump, but I don't think it happened because of Trump. I think it happened because these things came up, and the natural average instincts of conservatives, you know, we respect the police, and we believe in tradition, and we believe in fairness, and we believe in rewarding hard effort, suddenly became offended by some of these lunatic notions.
Yes, ma'am.
Would you reveal who you prefer as the Republican candidate for the president?
Who I would prefer as the Republican candidate? Well, of the contenders now, if I had my druthers, I'd probably choose Nikki Haley, who seems to be moving that direction. I don't think she's going to win. I think, frankly, she sells better with people like you than run-of-the-mill Republican voters. But I think she carried herself with a great deal of intelligence, composure, and she represents aspects of American life that I really admire, especially that aspirational side that, you know, her family, her life story is such an emblem of. Look, I suspect that the candidate will be Ron DeSantis. Ron DeSantis has figured out that the Republican Party is a three-legged stool. One leg is sort of Trumpy, own the libs stool, and he's very good at that. He is by far better than the master in that department. The other leg is evangelical, and the third one is sort of Chamber of Commerce Republicanism. And I don't know how many of you have been in Florida lately, but the place is hopping. It is a state that is doing well, and that's reflected in a near 60% majority that Governor DeSantis took when he ran. So there are aspects about his personality that grate on me, but if he runs against most Democrats, I would probably vote for him.
Yeah, I don't have a favorite. I want to win. So I'm doing everything I can to give them good coverage and entree to good people who want to help and promote them as best I can. And let's let them go out and compete.
The one thing I would say is I will never vote, ever. I would rather vote for Bernie Sanders than anyone who denies the election, anyone who denies basic democracy, anyone who isn't playing by the rules of the game. And that's foundational.
I'm there with you on running for president, but I have to admit I have too many friends in the Congress who, you know, were not courageous on that issue, and so, but I'm not going to hold it against them because they were afraid of going home and getting primaried, and also let's be honest about it, election denialism. Remember the sainted Representative Lewis of Georgia? What a great man, an election denier. George W. Bush didn't win the 2004 election. computers transferred 122,000 votes from John Kerry in Ohio to George W. Bush, and that's the only way we won. That's what he thought. So both parties have their own election deniers, whether it's Stacey Abrams or Elijah Cummings or Congressman Lewis, but I'm not going to hold it. And I don't want anybody who thinks that way to run for president. They're not going to get my vote. But I have to admit, I do have friends among the House Republicans who were less than courageous when standing up and saying hell no. I wrote a column, I think, 10 days after the election, saying all this hubbub is not going to change the outcome of the election because no statewide election in modern American history that has been reversed had more than a couple hundred votes contested, less than 1,000 votes. You should have seen what Donald Trump sent me that day. But, you know, I understand politics is practical, and some of my friends were like, you know, I'm ducking, and I'm not going to blame them for ducking. But when it comes to the presidency, I want somebody to go out there and demonstrate that they can unite the party, that they have a positive and optimistic vision for the future of the country, and that, by God, they're going to get in there and get us back on the right track.
Well, on January 6th, I wrote a column, January 6, 2021. That afternoon, I wrote a column that was titled Impeach and Convict Right Now. And if Republicans had taken my advice, the party would be in a whole lot better shape than it is today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.